Hello, everyone. Welcome back to CME Palooza Spring. Unless you're on the archive, then maybe this is your first time watching, then welcome to CME Palooza Spring. This is our 3 p.m. session. I'm going to bring up the slides. There we go. Our 3 p.m. session, Is That Compliant? Separating Fact from Fiction in Accredited CME. And I openly admit this is maybe the session I've been looking forward to the most, since accreditation used to be my life, and then I switched positions, and now I don't do it at all. So it will be a good refresher for me. The session is sponsored by Prova Education, and we're very thankful for their sponsorship. And our moderator for this is Mike Bafuto, who's president of Integrity Continuing Education. And our sponsors, as always, our gold sponsors, Genentech, Prova Education. Silver sponsors, ASIM, Forefront Collaborative, Global Academy for Medical Education, and Platform Q Health Education. I'm going to have to get glasses soon if these print keeps getting smaller. These ACHL, our bronze sponsors, ACHL, Clinical Care Options, CMEology, Helio Education Lab, Highmark CE, Impact Education, Integritas Communications, Connective, Primary Care Network, PVI, and RMEI. Last time, I have to do those today. 3 ways to ask questions, the same 3 ways as we've had all day. You can use the Educational Measures text line to send in a question, which is 267-666-0CME. You can click on the Google Slides link, which is found on the live page. So if you're watching the video, just look right underneath the video, and there will be a link. Make sure you click on the one for me, for Derek, not the one for Scott. And then you can also always tweet your question using the CME Palooza hashtag. I'll be monitoring questions throughout the session, and I'll be looking at any one of these, and they're all equally easy to use, so whichever is your preference. Be fine. And my last slide, our speaker disclosure slide. Opinions, discussions, and or conclusions expressed are our own and do not represent an endorsement by or position of our employer, its parent company, or affiliates. And with that, I am going to turn things over to Mike to get us started. Take it away, Mike.
Thanks, Derek. And hi, everybody. Thanks for joining this session or viewing it on the archives. Very happy to be here, and happy to have this excellent panel to talk about some issues in accreditation. First, I'll introduce them. We have Beth Brillinger, who is the Director of Accreditation, at CME Outfitters. CME Outfitters is accredited with commendation by the ACCME. She also manages certification of educational programs using ACPE criteria and a extremely long list of other accreditation types, many of which I don't even know what they are. So welcome, Beth. Mindy Daiga from Pri-Med, where she is the VP of CME Compliance and Operations. Mindy is also a former program administrator of accreditation and educational activities for the AMA, so certainly brings a really good perspective. Brooke Taylor is Assistant Dean for Continuing Medical Education at Oakland University William Beaumont School of Medicine, which conducts more than 300 activities and certifies more than 4,300 educational hours each year. Also an institution accredited with commendation. Both Beth and Mindy are volunteer surveyors for the ACCME, and Brooke is a member of the Accreditation Review Committee. So some excellent experience and insight into some issues in CME. When we first started talking about the content for this activity, I think the one thing we realized very quickly is that we could probably talk for 6 hours about all of the criteria. One of the questions we kind of had slated for our lightning round in our planning call, we spoke about for about 20 minutes. So we're going to try to move as quickly as possible, and in the interest of clarity, we're going to focus on the ACCME criterion. If we do shift and we start talking about something that has to do with ACPE or ANCC or another accrediting body, we'll do our best to call that out for you. And just want to once again say that the views and and opinions are representative of our own interpretation and experience, and certainly not representative or endorsed in any way by any accrediting body and of our organization. So with that, let's get into our lightning round, where we thought we would knock out a few of these common, sometimes funny, sometimes serious questions in CME. And Mindy, you are up to the plate first. So the age-old question in CME is, can a supporter be provided with participant information for CME activity? And I think many know the answer, but does the ACCME provide guidance related to this topic?
Sure, thanks, Mike, and hi, everyone. I'm going to start with the second piece of that regarding the ACCME, and they stay silent on this issue. We've all determined that there's probably a best practice that CME providers have their own policy about not providing this unless it's requested specifically for Sunshine Act. Based on that guidance or that government regulation, we do have to provide information to commercial supporters. It's very specific in what they're asking for. And given that Sunshine is where it is, if supporters are asking for it, we are in a position to be providing learner information to them.
And so, Beth, with that requirement in some instances, and I think many providers are looking at ways to avoid having to report, and certainly many supporters are just not funding activities that would require that reporting to get done. I think there's universal agreement that it's kind of a nuisance, and it, is a major undertaking to report on a single activity. I can't imagine reporting for a $1 billion pharmaceutical company. But what limitations are there on what they can do with that data once it leaves your inbox and goes over to a funder for Sunshine Act reporting?
Right. So for Sunshine Act reporting, I think that the most important thing is that we've recently had a significant clarification of the rules from the CMS. So we as educational providers are more aware of what the Sunshine Act is looking for. And generally speaking, those educational activities that are planned independently of a grantor or a commercial interest are not that information from those activities and the participants that attended the activities, we don't have to report for Sunshine Act reporting. As the supporters are getting more aware of this, they're sort of removing this from their, letters of agreement and requirements. Some supporters will even remove the idea that the food for an educational activity is supported by grant funding. So what that means for us, basically, is that we are not getting asked for some of that data like we were a year or so ago, which is good news for us. I'm going to back up a little bit into Mindy's statement that the ACCME is staying silent on the idea that we can or cannot provide attendance data to a supporter. Definitely true. But I think we need to think about it from our perspective as an educational provider too, because we want to make sure that those folks that come and participate in our activity are protected in a way, that their information isn't handed out to anyone that they don't want it handed out to. We don't provide their information so that they receive some unwanted marketing. I can tell you that even with our own educational activities, we'll ask for permission to reach out to our participants and ask them follow-up questions about answers they gave us on their evaluation form. I think it's in the spirit of CME, and independent medical education, we want to make sure that our participants' data is held confidential. And for that reason, I think it's important if a provider wants to, write a policy about how that data could be distributed, that would be a good idea for a provider to do, to follow for their own reasons.
So, Brooke, I'll ask you this question. When we're talking about transfer of value and Sunshine Act data and how it relates to really accreditation and Criterion 9, providing separation between promotion and education, what can a provider look for in a letter of agreement to make sure that the data they're providing will be used for Sunshine Act, and just have that safeguard in place?
That's a great question. I think just looking for those terms, and I think a lot of letters of agreement these days do specify Sunshine Act. So, you really have to read every term and make sure that there are terms and conditions. We, see a lot of different LOAs come across my desk, and some are very, very vague. And those I want to get more clarification of, is there more information to this? Are there more terms and conditions? And making sure those terms and conditions can comply with your own institutional policies, as well as, protecting your learners.
And I think the one other issue that came up when we talked about this in planning was that relationship with the supporter. And how I don't think any, certainly the medical education companies, but even on the institution and society side, would say we're not going to accept this funding because of this stipulation in your letter of agreement. So I think the concern is on both the provider and the supporter side. So if you are a provider and you are faced with the situation, you probably can discuss it with the supporter and hopefully can get modifications to the letter of agreement, because outside of or I think the big funders, the major funders, have the correct language already, because they have huge legal teams and tons of experience in this area.
Yeah. And Mike, one other thing to tag on, if you're not using the LOA from one of those companies, you could write this into your own version of an LOA, indicating that you're not going to provide the participant list, or you will provide it only in accordance with your own institution policy, provided you have one, saying that you're not going to share it. And that gives you something to back up if they do request information that you're not interested or comfortable in sharing.
That's a great point, because
that's a place to refer to.
It does happen, especially with some of the smaller funders.
Right.
Okay, so another topic that comes up quite frequently, this one's for you, Beth, is can a supporter provide distribution of invitations for a CME activity?
Right, so that would be like a brochure or a save the date card. Yes, there's nothing in the standards of commercial support that say that a provider cannot allow that to happen. I think an important differentiation, though, is that a supporter cannot provide the actual educational activity to a learner. That could be an enduring material. An example might be a certified monograph or something like that. That can't happen, and that is specifically in the standards for commercial support. But you can request assistance from the commercial supporter in handing out the brochure or announcement for the activity.
And this is something that the ACCME does actually provide guidance on, right? In the form of an Ask ACCME, I think.
Yeah, so there's a bit of information about this specifically in the FAQs or Ask the ACCME section. And there's also a little bit on one of the videos that the ACCME has up, one of the sort of case study videos.
Perfect. Okay, so I know when we start thinking about outcomes, we always want to avoid true or false, but we're going to ignore that entirely. So Mindy, true or false? It's non-compliant for a physician's spouse to attend an accredited CME activity.
Sure. I think the only thing you would need to consider is your own policies as a CME provider. There's nothing saying that only physicians can attend a CME activity. That's really up to you. Obviously, you wouldn't be able to award them credit unless they are also a physician, but there's nothing prohibiting them from participating or observing. They could be a learner just as well. So I would say that they could participate.
Okay. Brooke, this is a mouthful. The learning objectives, support disclosure, provider statement, accreditation statement, credit designation, faculty information, whatever other piece of information may be required on our materials must be included on every invitation, postcard, and promotional piece that's developed for an activity.
That would be false. There are some different requirements. So, for example, the ACCME does require that you have to have the correct accreditation statement somewhere within the brochure. They do have an exception, and that's for initial save the date type announcements, and those are very basic information about the activity. Those don't have to include that full accreditation statement. However, if you want to have more specific information, such as the faculty and the objectives, then you do have to have that full accreditation statement. Now, the AMA has separate requirements that you need to be aware of as a provider. And so the AMA does require that the AMA credit designation statement be used in any program materials that reference CME credit. And you have to have it written without paraphrasing and have it be listed separate from that accreditation or other statements. You can't combine those two statements together. They do have to be separate. If you ever want to reference the number of CME credits, then you're supposed to use that full AMA credit designation statement. They do also have an exception with the save the date type announcement, and that they have an abbreviated statement that you can use for those types of postcards with limited information, just date, location, topic, etc. One thing that the AMA specifies is that you're never to indicate that AMA PRA Category 1 credit has been applied for or is pending or any similar wording. So those are the two areas from a CME, ACCME, and AMA perspective that we do need to be aware of.
Okay, so if you're doing a save the date and you have a little starburst or a little graphic element on it that says up to 2 credits, up to 2 CME credits, the AMA statement needs to be in full as well, somewhere on that piece.
Right, that's what they say. Yeah.
And Beth, different accrediting bodies, do they have different policies that affect this?
Yeah, sure. So I happen to work at a company that has multiple accreditations, and while it's often that we'll have an activity that's just certified for CME credit, and we follow those rules that Brooke just mentioned. But more often than not, we also have some additional types of CE certifications added to it, like credit for pharmacists with the ACPE, or credit for nurses, or credit for other types of healthcare professionals. And you have to be well aware of what their rules are as far as some of these pieces that you've mentioned, like the learning objectives, the provider statement, the faculty information, et cetera. I mean, some of the learning objectives may be very specific as far as the nurse accreditation and the nurse learning objectives that are written in a slightly different way than physician learning objectives. So it is something that if you've got multiple accreditations, you can't just think about the CME needs. You have to reach out and make sure you're covering all the bases with all of your accreditations.
And probably to get to not end up spending your entire budget on just invitation production, you've got to be a little creative about the way you're developing pieces. And I think at the same time, if you're just applying AMA credit to something, you should be mindful of what needs to be there and what doesn't need to be there, because a 6-panel invite costs a lot more than a save the date card. And especially that far out.
And I think it's important too, create checklists and put what's required for each thing so that you have something to model after and don't have to remember each time what is required. And use websites. You can put a lot of information on a website and then limit what's on your save the date or your mailer. So it's not quite so lengthy and more postage usually.
Great point. Okay, so I think at this point, it's pretty well known that you can ask a commercial supporter for suggestions for speakers or suggestions for specific topics related to this to a CME activity. One thing I've struggled with, and I don't know if this is really a practical issue, but certainly I think about the possibility of it coming back to bite me in the behind is. What happens when we reply to an RFP that's posted by a supporter? Is that them directing content, or is that not a compliance issue? And that one is for you, Mindy.
Sure. I actually was able to find something that the ACCME put out several years ago. So I don't know if it was quite in the format of an FAQ that they currently do, But they say it is reasonable for a supporter to share general information about their areas of interest where they might be offering funding, and also identifying levels of funding that that they're interested in. And this is usually communicated via website, so that obviously direct communication is discouraged. But then it's up to the CME provider to take this information, and they then have to direct all the content and make all of their decisions that wouldn't be directed by that commercial supporter. So based on the funding that that a commercial supporter would provide, the CME provider is still responsible for everything, identifying the faculty, identifying the learning objectives, the content, etc. So they're still in complete control of the planning and implementation of the activity, which is what's really important here.
Great. And I think that any accredited provider probably spends a lot of time on their policies associated with criteria 1 through 6, and in the documentation of those. So I wouldn't expect there to be an issue unless the provider submitted an activity that said, we got this idea from an RFP, and that was the genesis of our activity.
Yeah, and ultimately the provider is going to have to identify that they see a need for the activity based on what they see, and make sure that it matches up. That's still something that's their responsibility, not the commercial suppliers.
Agreed. So we went back and we looked at the executive summaries from the ACCME's board of directors meetings for the past 2 years. I don't have the exact figure here, but I think it was about 270 providers were reviewed in the past 2 years, and 22% of providers were non-compliant with criterion 7, which is the provider develops activities and educational interventions independent of commercial interests. And specifically, this relates to standards for commercial support 1, 2, and 6, which are identification, resolution, and disclosure of conflict of interest. So we wanted to spend some time talking about this criteria because it's by far the largest area of noncompliance, and we put together this case study, which is near and dear to my heart because it's derived directly from the self-study that my organization submitted in 2008, our first application for provisional accreditation, in which we were denied. And I think our policies were correct and our practices were correct, but our understanding of the way the ACCME wanted those policies to be applied and documented were absent. And I would assume this is a common problem for new providers and providers seeking provisional accreditation. But the case study is American CME Company is a non-accredited medical education provider applying for provisional. In their self-study, they've described a conflict identification and resolution process that includes completion of disclosure forms for all individuals in control of content, the review of those forms, and disclosure of the identified conflicts to participants via relevant program materials. They have a specific notation that individuals who refuse to disclose are disqualified from an activity, and they describe a conflict resolution process that includes careful review of content internally, along with external reviewers to alter content of any educational material that is bound to have bias, revision or limitation of the role of an individual so that the relationship is no longer relevant, exclusion of individuals from content creation or presentation if necessary, and a blanket statement that they ensure the CME content reflects the best available evidence by utilizing expert opinion, perceived educational needs, lit surveys, clinical trial info, reviews, and guidelines. So based on that information, oh wait, we didn't pick somebody for this one. Brooke, based on that information, is the provider on the right track towards compliance with criterion 7?
Yeah, it sounds like in reviewing this, they are on the right track. They're reviewing the content, doing more than just a disclosure. They have a mechanism for those that refuse to disclose of how to disqualify them. So, based on this information, it seems like they are on the right track.
And so in their self-study, they provide examples of 2 activities. And the evidence they use of their implementation of the policy is a copy of their identification and resolution of conflict policy, relevant financial disclosures for all individuals in control of content for those activities, and disclosure of the conflicts to learners for those completed activities. So Beth, and I think as a surveyor, you had sort of a unique perspective on this because you felt that you could probably derive some information from the provider here that may help their case towards compliance. But with this information, have they achieved compliance?
Yeah, I want to dive into that for a second, but before I do, I'm going to kind of put in a plug here. For anybody listening to this presentation, you're probably wanting to learn more about accreditation in general. And I got to tell you, the best way that I did that was to become an ACCME surveyor, and I've been doing it for about 5 years now. And boy, it helps out so much. You get to know the folks at the ACCME, and I'm sure for some providers, it's a little frightening going through the process or trying to figure out what some of the rules are that you must follow. And just becoming an ACCME volunteer surveyor helped me learn so much, although at that point in time, I had already been in CME for 15 years, and it's now going on 20 years that I've been doing this. So it's easy to check out on the ACCME's website. I think there's a button that says volunteering. There's a criteria form that you fill out to see if you meet the criteria to become a surveyor. But I would highly recommend to anybody that wants to learn. ACCME is looking for surveyors all the time, and it's an amazing experience. So to your question, when I first saw this write-up of this case presentation, Mike, I remember thinking to myself, and I'm putting on my surveyor hat, of the questions that I would ask to this provider to get more information, because my job as a surveyor is to find out some more information that may not be written up in the self-study. And although it is looking like it's compliant, I'd still ask the questions, because these are the notes that I would provide to the ACCME. I don't make the decisions about the accreditation for anybody. I just interview this, provider, review the self-study, review the performance and practice activities, and then provide additional information as I find it through the interview. So I would have asked questions about, in your description, you talked about carefully reviewing the content internally, along with external reviewers. Well, what does that mean? What does carefully reviewing consist of? You also mentioned, revision or limitation of the role of individuals so that the relationship is no longer relevant. Well, what does that mean? Tell me more about that. And if I find out that additional information, I can provide those notes, which eventually go to the Accreditation Review Committee to help them understand this program a little bit better. But to your specific question, Mike, where you explained what the provider provided with those 2 examples, the thought occurs to me as well, wow, where did you document these steps? So, I think that where you guys may have run into trouble is that you didn't provide the documentation of how this was done. This summary that you gave us looks pretty good until you gave us the additional information that you kind of didn't have a process documented for how these reviews were done.
Exactly, and I think the problem we had, and the problem I think a lot of non-accredited providers have, is they work in joint support, in joint providership, and the accredited provider is doing a lot of stuff on the back end that you're not aware of at all. You submit content for review, and they come back and they say it's approved, but in the meantime, they've probably gotten disclosure information for every planner or every person that's had their hands on that content. Those people are without conflict. Those reviews are in line with their policies. So there's a lot of steps that I think the non-accredited provider just doesn't see happening.
I just wanted to add a couple of things to that comment, Mike. When a non-accredited provider is working with an accredited provider, and the non-accredited provider will be seeking their own provisional accreditation status, great point. Ask questions. Find out what the process is behind the scenes. Work with those folks to help you to learn about what some of the requirements are, because they're an excellent resource. And you can't, I think this is true, help me guys, but you can't apply for provisional accreditation unless you have 2 activities that were certified for CME under your belt.
I believe that's correct.
Yeah, I think.
We'll just go with it.
Somebody correct me later.
We can edit the video if we find out otherwise.
Oh, good.
It's not live or anything like that.
Oh, good.
So, Brooke, one of the things that you noted was a major issue, and I was surprised by this. But in identification of conflict of interest, and this is a pretty simple problem, but a lot of providers just don't have the correct definition of a commercial interest on their disclosure form, which leads to a finding of non-compliance. So how common of a problem is that, and what are the pitfalls? What are some of the other pitfalls of that conflict identification process?
Yeah, unfortunately, that is something that's more common than it probably should be. I think the ACCME did send out a letter back in February of 2016 to all accredited providers, giving them some tips for how to be compliant in this area. And that was one of the main things they mentioned was, just look at your form, see if your definition is correct. I see this. I also serve as a member of my state medical society's accreditation CME committee, and I'm now co-chair of that committee as well. And so we're still seeing that a lot with our smaller hospitals, and trying to help get the message across. Just, ACCME has their definition on their website. Just take a look at it, make sure your form has that definition, because without it, you may not be collecting all of the relevant relationships that you're supposed to be doing, and that could be a non-compliance finding. So it's really important. And where, I look back at my forms couple of years ago and realized one of our forms, we had a paper form and we had an online form, and we had different definitions. So we had one with the correct definition, one with an older, more basic definition. So even just that, making sure if you have multiple forms, make sure it's updated everywhere. And that definition is on the ACCME website. So take a look at that and just check out your forms. There are also a lot of pitfalls. So as I mentioned, this letter that Graham McMahon sent out to all providers, it had a lot of strategies and just reminders to ensure compliance. So that was a really good tool. And it is, I did look it up today, it is still available on their website. So you can go see that for yourself. But really just making sure that you collect information from everyone who's involved. So whether they're planning, reviewing, they're an author, they're editing, teaching, evaluating activities, they're considered in control of content. And so you need to make sure you're collecting your disclosure information from everyone. And then sometimes you might have an activity with a lot of people involved and it's hard to keep track of them. So, create a spreadsheet or some sort of tool to help you keep track of all the individuals involved and whether you've collected the right information from them and resolve those relationships if needed. Making sure your mechanism of identification also includes information about that individual's partner or significant other, spouse. So sometimes that's left off, and that would be a non-compliance finding. So you are required to not only identify relationships of the individual, but their spouse or partner as well. There are still some providers I've seen who who are asking for minimum amounts. Their disclosure might say, have a threshold or something like that. And ACCME does not have a minimum amount. It's any dollar amount. So just making sure that your form is collecting anything. Confirming that anyone in control of content is not an employee of a commercial interest. There are a few exceptions that I think we'll talk about a little bit later. But if somebody is an employee, there's additional steps that you need to go through. Making sure that you have time to resolve relationships. So I know there are always situations where a speaker might change at the last minute, or they might be out of the country and not doing the form. And so those are unavoidable. But if possible, you want to try to collect your disclosures far enough in advance that you have time to implement your resolution mechanism. Making sure that you have records to show what you did. So what we talked about in that case sample, there wasn't enough documentation showing that you implemented your own policies. So it's not enough just to have the policy, but you need to document if you resolved it. What was your mechanism to resolve? At my organization, we have a form, and our mechanism for resolution is peer review. We look at the slides, but we document that. We have a form that we document to say whether we feel that the relationship is resolved or not, so that that's documented each time. And then disclosure is important too. Some people feel that an acceptable resolution mechanism is just the simple disclosure to the learners of the relationships, and it has to go a little bit further than that, and it needs to happen before the activity, not at the time of the activity. So, and this was all in that letter provided by ACCME, and all things that I think are really important to keep in mind.
And Brooke, we had a question come in, and you probably are the best suited to answer this. Do you have any thoughts on why this is an issue year after year? Why do we find so much non-compliance in this area?
I think, if it's because of the definition, I think a lot of people, we create forms and we use them over and over and over, but we don't always go back and look at them and see if anything has changed. And, I think the definition came out in 2010 when the standards came out. It may have even been longer than that. I don't remember now, but, some people may be still using a form from 2008, 2007, because it's convenient and it's there. So it's really just, every year trying to go through and look at your forms and look at your processes and see if they are still in alignment with the standards and criteria, or at least the intent of them.
Okay. So Mindy, documenting in forms, clearly very important, but we know the ACCME asks for less information. They want more explanation in less information. And there's probably not one of us who hasn't measured a self-study binder with a ruler to make sure it was less than whatever the thickness is. But how do we document this stuff and not have 1,000 pages of material to submit to the ACCME every 4 or 6 years?
Yep, absolutely. And I think this is going to come up more so in the performance and practice files. And Brooke already touched on several of these things, but I'm a really big fan of standard forms. If you have a peer reviewer, it's great to just send out that standard form. You might have some checkboxes for them, some open text boxes. Make it as easy as possible for them to get the information back to you. Also, there's no requirement in how you document it, just that you do have some kind of documentation process. So if you're having a email communication with a peer reviewer or whoever might be helping you resolve the conflict, you can just print that email or save that email to your file. As long as it has adequate detail that you can glean, if you're just looking at that chain, 2 or 3 years later, that would be sufficient as well. We also, in my company, use a lot of Excel spreadsheets to track, so if, let's say we're on site and we have speakers bringing in new content or they've made some changes, we may have somebody right there in a speaker ready room or somewhere on site to review the content. And we simply make notes right there in an Excel grid, and we have one, for each CME activity. And it's an easy way. It's kind of built into the process, but just makes it easy to collect all that information. Yes, we all have papers and stacks and, can kill more trees than I'd like to think about. And, everybody says our job is document, document, document. But it's true. It's going to make it so much easier when the reaccreditation process comes around. And sometimes it's hard to look back at communications and try to figure out what in the world you might have been talking about. So, just try to make it systematic. As much as we don't like more paper, use those standard forms, save those emails, and it'll make it so much easier also when you're submitting those files and you have a really succinct statement, and it's really easy for the surveyors to follow and understand when it's the same in all of them. It'll definitely help everybody out.
Awesome. And I think definitely succinct and standardized is key. If you're searching your company server across 1,500 activities every 4 or 6 years for a single document, you're in trouble for sure.
Yeah.
So Beth, both Mindy and Brooke mentioned using a peer review or an independent review of content for resolution of COI. I think it's probably a pretty common practice. I know we do the same. Does the ACCME have a requirement on what constitutes an adequate independent review or subject matter expert when it comes to these reviews?
So yeah, no. The standards for commercial support 2.3 just says, implement a mechanism to identify and resolve all conflicts of interest prior to the educational activity taking place. We as providers have to develop our own process. I like peer reviewers as well. And we happen to use peer reviewers that are not employees of our company. But the ACCME doesn't tell you what to do and how to do this.
So it can be, as long as they have no conflict with the content they're reviewing, it can actually be an employee of your organization.
Yeah, meaning you're the educational provider, that organization. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Excellent. So Brooke, we had some pretty lengthy discussion about this on our planning calls, but another special consideration is when a faculty, and you mentioned this, when a faculty or planning committee member is an employee of a commercial interest. Can you just use your standard conflict of interest resolution process?
Yeah, this is a great question, and one that actually I struggled with a few years ago, thinking that I could just resolve the conflict of interest, the employment conflict of interest, using my normal peer review process. But in reality, what ACCME says is that an employee of an ACCME-defined commercial interest may only participate as faculty planners or other roles where they're in a position to control content within 3 restricted roles. And so these 3 special case uses are when the content of the activity is not related to the business lines or products of their employer, when the content of the activity is limited to basic science research or the processes and methodologies of research that are unrelated to a specific disease or compound or drug. And then the third use is employees can participate as technicians in accredited activities that teach the safe and proper use of medical devices, as long as they have no control of the activity content that's related to clinical recommendations concerning the business lines or products of their employers. So those are the only 3 situations right now. And, it seems very cut and dry there, but there are, other gray areas where it's kind of, well, does it fall into this special case or is it something different? So you really have to look at what the employment relationship is. But what ACCME says is that because employees have a fiduciary responsibility to their employers, it creates a conflict of interest that cannot be resolved. So they are in a different category than those individuals who have just a relevant financial relationship that could be consulting or stock options, things like that. So they are a separate category. And so it's kind of challenging, and I have it come across my desk a lot, and sometimes we're able to put it into the special use case and sometimes we're not, and then we have to work with our departments to say, this, unfortunately, we're not allowed to have this individual be involved and have to try to make some different arrangements for that.
Mm-hmm. And now what about if the conflict lies with the faculty or planner's spouse?
Yeah, so this is another big one that we've dealt with at my institution. Previously, the ACCME does still view the relationships of the individual spouse to be those relationships of the individual. So previously, their standpoint on spouses who were employees was that you could not resolve those relationships. But in September of 2016, they actually came out with new information saying that based on feedback they had gotten from other organizations and just looking at things a little bit more, they've decided that employment relationships that are of the spouse or significant other, those can now be resolved using your normal conflict of interest resolution mechanisms. However, if the employment is of the individual who is involved, those cannot be resolved. So that was a huge change that they made, and had a lot of impact on some of my faculty speakers in a positive way. So you really just, if it's the individual themselves, it's an employee, you have to look at those 3 special use cases to see if it falls there. But if it's the spouse or significant other, you can do your normal resolution mechanisms.
So Mindy, we talked a little bit about disclosure And I think one of the things we landed on was having the wrong definition of a commercial interest in your disclosure form is going to lead down a path towards non-compliance with standard for commercial support 6.
Right.
Do you have to disclose do you have to provide disclosure for every single planner involved in a CME activity?
Well, you do. For people who don't have any relevant financial relationships, you don't have to list every single person by name, though. You can include a blanket statement saying all planners or all staff or all whatever group you're referring to have no relevant financial relationships to disclose. As long as you've collected that information, you're then appropriately disclosing it just in a blanket statement. So that is acceptable. One thing I would also kind of add to something Brooke mentioned earlier is making sure you collect information for everybody. And one of the biggest areas I see where people forget is a CME planning committee. Mm-hmm. They may not be directly what seems like directly involved in planning of an individual activity, but inevitably they're involved from a high level, strategic level, deciding on topics, maybe reviewing outcomes and helping with future planning. It just depends on what your process is. But that's often an area where I see providers failing to identify. And if you don't identify the appropriate financial relationships, you can't obviously disclose them to your learners. And when you're doing your self-study, think about that org chart you put. It's one of the first 2 chapters, I think. It's always at the very, very beginning. Think of that org chart and really think about everybody that is included on that org chart. Chances are they should all be providing their financial information, and that should be included for perhaps all of your activities. Definitely a case by case, but it's a good area to look at and consider.
And so if using and this is a question that came in, if you're using a blanket disclosure statement, do you still need to have record of disclosure from each of those individuals?
Absolutely. You have to have some kind of record indicating that you collected their information and their financial relationships.
Okay. And so this is a question I have. We collect disclosures for our planners for every activity. Do you have to do it for every activity, or can you get disclosure from your internal planners at the beginning of every year, and that's that disclosure works for each activity they're involved with for the year?
I can take that one. It's totally fine to do it once a year, as long as it's done. The ACCME says relevant is defined as the previous 12 months. So as long as it's within that window, and also pay attention to the word relevant if it's related to the topic of that CME activity. But doing it once a year or every 6 months or once a series might be sufficient. Okay.
Yeah. So what we end up with every year is 30 disclosure forms signed by our medical director that says, I have nothing to disclose. It's good to know. We can only have one. So Beth, let's quickly, because I would like to get to the accreditation with commendation materials if we can, as much as you guys may want to just run out of time before then. But criterion 11, which deals with evaluation of activities towards meeting your mission. A little bit of non-compliance from that same 270 or so providers, about 7%. And I know as a new provider, I had trouble collecting data that was correct to sort of answer that question of, are we meeting our mission? So 2-part question. Can you provide recommendations from your experience of how providers can position themselves to be sure they're collecting the correct data? And second, should we consider the strength and quality of the data we can collect when we look at developing or revising our mission statement?
Oh, sure. So I just want to share a resource with everyone that I've always found valuable, and that's the examples of compliance and non-compliance that the ACCME has on its website. Pretty much you just go to their search function and type in the word compendium. because they call it their compendium of examples of compliance and non-compliance, or at least they have in the past. And it's a big, thick document if you print it out, but it has some excellent examples for each criteria of compliance and non-compliance. And I actually pulled up the Criterion 11 section to think about this question, Mike. And I'm going to share with you an example that I use and we use in our company. But there were a lot of really good examples how a provider would meet Criterion 11. But the most important thing to remember when assessing any of your educational activities is that we need to measure more than just knowledge change, because each of our mission statements goes much farther than just knowledge. You know, we're going for the adequate data and at the very best patient performance change, positively affecting patient care, but we're also looking for competence. So what I would suggest as a great example would be, in addition to your standard evaluation questions, just trying to measure satisfaction, perhaps changes in knowledge with a pre and post test or something like that, is that, and this is what we do, for every educational activity that we conduct as just a baseline, we ask a few commitment to change questions on the evaluation form related to the content, and often spinning directly off of the learning objectives that were developed for the activity. So we ask the participant if they are going to make a commitment to change any of their practice or behaviors based on the educational activity that they just participated in. And then we also ask them to opt in to allow us to contact them in a few months and follow up and ask them if they found that they've made these changes. So this is and can be certainly interpreted as a subjective kind of answer. But I think that the most important thing to say is that this is our baseline. We have a lot of educational activities where we do much more in the spirit of educational outcomes and achieving a level of performance or patient health outcomes, or, you know, much higher level types of feedback where we are actually interviewing the participants. We've even interviewed patients of some of our participants to assess if that participant changed their practice behavior in the patient's eyes. There's so many places that you can go when it comes to measuring outcomes. But in order to be compliant with that Criterion 11, you've got to reach for more than just measuring a change in knowledge.
Okay, great.
Yeah. I think I answered it, the rest of the question.
So we had some planned discussion on accreditation with commendation. We don't. I don't want to get into every criteria because there are 15 of them. We do have 8 minutes, 30 seconds each. We probably could do it, but there's a new menu of criteria for accreditation with commendation, as probably all of us know. It's a 7+1 format, so you have to demonstrate criteria with compliance with 7 criteria from 4 categories: promotes team-based education, addresses public health priorities, enhances skills, and demonstrated educational leadership. And then you have to demonstrate compliance with 1 criteria from the category of achieves outcomes. So when we talked about this in planning, I don't remember which one of you countered, but I said I thought this was an easier set of criteria to achieve commendation, and that was because I wasn't thinking about the frequency that they're looking for activities. So we no longer just have to show that we achieve compliance with the criteria once over the course of an accreditation term. The ACCME is asking us to do it. For instance, criteria 23, members of interprofessional teams are engaged in the planning and delivering of interprofessional continuing education. That's a relatively easy criteria to achieve commendation, but in order to achieve compliance there, it has to happen in 10% of your activities. And if you're an extra large organization, meaning you do 250 activities in an accreditation cycle, you have to provide evidence of it for 8 different activities. So it's a lot of work, for sure. Do you guys have any thoughts, any like pearls or anything you've come up with for accreditation with commendation that you'd just like to share here?
Hold on, before we move on to that, Mike, let me do my end slides real quick here.
Okay.
And then we'll move on. So we're going to keep going for a few more minutes. We might run overtime. Scott is aware of this. He's going to start up the new session at the usual time, but this will be available on the archive. So it's like bonus material. Get the DVD. If you want to watch, you have to do the archive. We'll go for a couple more minutes. But let me do my ending slides. We don't need disclosure. If you haven't already, which you probably shouldn't because you're not done yet, but take our survey when you're done watching the sessions. There's a link right underneath the video, 7 questions. It'll only take you about 5 minutes. And then lastly, to view the next session, which will come up at regular time, you're going to have to refresh your screen probably right around 3:57, 3:58 or so. And Scott will get started with our last session of the day at the top of the hour, celebrating our mistakes, a retrospective analysis of what went wrong. And with that, I will turn it back over to Mike.
Okay, Beth, real quick before we start discussing this, when does all of this become a consideration for us? When do providers need to start using these criteria to achieve commendation?
Right. So we have some time. If there is a transition phase that the ACCME has put into place here, and the guidelines are providers who will receive accreditation decisions, or in other words, their decisions about whether they have achieved their next number of years of accreditation between right now and November 2019. Have the choice of using our current criteria, that's criteria 16 through 22, or using the new commendation criteria, that's criteria 23 through 38. So we have some time. I know that I'm up for our reaccreditation. My surveys, my self-studies due to the ACCME in July. So I already know that we're going to use the current accreditation criteria. But if you know that you'll be up for renewing your criteria after, that decision date of November 2019, then you need to start paying attention to this information because it's what you'll need to go by.
So it's possible the ACCME would be flooded with calls asking to move up into an earlier cohort.
I suppose that's a possibility. And I will say this too. One thing that I have always noticed about the ACCME is that they're constantly updating their website with new educational material. And this new commendation criteria is going to be huge as far as us providers trying to figure out what it is. And I don't have a grasp on it myself quite yet. And the ACCME does have a big meeting in Chicago next week, which one of us is going to. It's not me. But they'll obviously be covering that information at that meeting. And I do encourage everyone to continue looking at the educational materials that they provide, because if there's anything that I know about them, they definitely want providers to have all the information possible and to be very clear about what they're looking for.
Beth, can I add to that?
Yeah.
You can sign up for, ACCME has a monthly newsletter, and anybody can sign up for that. It's free, and it comes right into your email box. But they are starting to give examples of compliance and non-compliance for the new criterion and additional examples. So if you're on that newsletter, you'll get those right to you. And I'm printing them and trying to review them and figure out what we're supposed to be doing. So it's a nice resource.
Mindy, any thoughts on the new commendation criteria?
Yeah, my biggest advice, and this is something where my company is going through right now, is as soon as you figure out when you're going to start implementing it, or well in advance of that, figure out what database and what kind of recording mechanisms you need based on the change in how they're asking for information. If it's a certain number of activities per year or a certain percentage you're going to have to be tracking this from the very beginning of your accreditation period. It's going to be much, much harder to wait till the end of 4 years or the end of 6 years and think back for a handful of examples. If it has to be, a certain number from 6 years ago, you're going to be really hard pressed to come up with that in the absence of any kind of, database or tracking mechanism. So start working now and get that in place so you're ready when the time comes.
Yeah, and I'll add to that a little bit, Mindy. I know that for our program, when I saw the new accreditation with commendation criteria, I kind of sat down and reviewed the definition of what they were looking for each criterion, and then thought up some of the things that we were doing that would meet those definitions.
Right.
And I felt pretty good. Like, I felt like there were a lot of things that we were doing and that we could easily do. But the one thing you have to pay attention to is where you fit into the number of activities that you actually have to show to prove that you've met that criteria, because those numbers differ on each line. So it's based on whether you're considered a small, medium, or large program, and there's parameters for you to fit into as far as, how many activities you provide in a year. So you really have to figure that out too. And then I said, oh, wow, we have to do 8 of these. I know we did 2 in this time frame. Okay, we need to bump that up and do more of those if we want to meet that criterion. So it is really good, although it seems like it's far away. Excellent to start thinking about it now.
Absolutely. And chances are it's going to be part of a bigger part of your annual strategy and planning, because like you said, if you've only done 2 of a certain type of activity and you have to hit 4, that might become a really big priority for your next planning.
Exactly.
Few months.
So we're over time. If you guys still have time, we have about 4 questions. Excuse me. About 4 questions that came in that we haven't gotten to, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
So
let me chime in real quick. I'm going to chime in real quick. Anyone who's still watching, just hit refresh. You can stop the video, hit refresh, and then you'll get the feed for the newest 4 o'clock session. So just letting everyone
Thanks,
know.
everybody.
Yeah.
All right, so the director's cut. Have you, Beth, I'll ask you this one. Have you had any pushback from funders when altering a letter of agreement for compliance reasons?
For whose compliance reasons?
Well, I think this came up when we were talking about the Sunshine Act. So.
Yeah.
I think the question was.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it was in reference to. Well, it was back towards the beginning when I typed it in, and you had talked about if you needed to ask them. Shoot, what did it have to do? I forget the exact example, but it was if you need to go to the funder and say, we need to change this. It was something with sharing information, participant lists, something along that line.
Okay. Yeah.
I might be wrong. If not, we can skip over this.
I mean, I can chime in here because I have had some pushback before, and it's been, things like, and this came up more recently. We're working with an accredited or an educational partner. It's a joint providership, and the joint provider, with our permission, they were the ones to submit the grant. And even though we educated them on what's required and how to list things, and I don't recall now if it was just the grantors, the commercial supporters website, how the information went in. But when the grant got approved, the LOA did not mention my organization at all. And that is a requirement, an ACCME standards for commercial support requirement, that the agreement be between the commercial supporter and the accredited provider. So we went back and forth, and finally we had to just resubmit under my organization just to get the language correct on the LOA. So there was some pushback there, but we did find a workaround. I've had other situations where, and I don't see this as much anymore, but in letters of agreement, there used to be language about the provider will request a list of speakers or this commercial supporter will make a list of speakers available upon request. Well, my legal department, once ACCME came out with more clarification that that's not allowed, we didn't even want that as part of the LOA, so we would strike that out. And sometimes we get some pushback, but it's just getting legal departments to work together.
Yeah, and so in my role, and we're a much smaller company, but I function in a business development role as well. A lot of the bigger funders, their LOAs are fine, but they do say you will be required to sign this LOA with no changes. The smaller funders, I've never gotten pushback per se, but a request for a change to an LOA for like a mid-size or a small pharma company, it could take 3 months.
Yeah.
And it really, it messes up your timelines quite a bit. So not necessarily pushback, but be prepared for a lengthy wait time because legal departments move at legal department speed. Okay, so
hey, Mike.
Go. Yeah.
I'll also add that from a commercial supporter's perspective as well, it is in their best interest from a compliance perspective to follow the same guidelines for the way a letter of agreement is written as what the ACCME holds up as an example. I mean, the content still has to be the same and basically cover the idea that this is an independent medical education and the supporter is not allowed to influence the content in any way. And that has to be the way that it's written. But, in the day and age of corporate integrity agreements and OIG, I mean, it is in a supporter's best interest to have that mindset as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So have any of you ever had any situation where one accreditation or one certifying body's policies were not in line with another certifying body's policies? Or is it like state and federal law, the stricter one prevails at all times?
I found that the policies often complement one another. There are some times when accreditors would have additional requirements as, specific as what the questions will be on the evaluation form. And I remember thinking, well, it's not even a very good question, but okay. But, for me, the highest standard is always CME, the ACCME accreditation. And the other, accreditations are often complementary. Sometimes they ask for more, the way that ACPE needs more on a publicity material. But it's okay. Like, they complement one another. You do have to keep in mind what everybody needs if that's the type of certification you're applying to that activity. But I don't think I've come across a situation where there's a conflict.
The only example I can think of, it's a conflict, but something we were able to work around. If accrediting for nurses as well as physicians, sometimes you might have two different sets of learning objectives. And you simply have to print both and communicate both of them. So yes, you're going to have more material, but knowing it may not always be global like that. But definitely something you can work around. Not always ideal, but certainly doable.
Yeah. And certainly, there's no criteria from one body that would throw you out of compliance with another body.
Correct.
So let me just reading here. I know we addressed a couple of these. So if you guys are working in joint providership with a non-accredited provider, how do you resolve issues with companies that do non-CME work, that provide promotional research or other communication services for pharma?
This is something I talked about when we were planning for this session. It wasn't exactly related to this question, but there is a questionnaire, a joint sponsorship or joint providership questionnaire that is fairly common. I don't think the questionnaire itself is on the ACCME website. They do have a list of questions that you can ask partners when you're interested in working with them. And the intent behind it is to make sure that their organizational structure is appropriate and that they are appropriately firewalled. So that's a great resource if you're working with a new partner. And it's in that joint providership role. send them that questionnaire. It's a great starting point for that conversation.
Okay, and last question here. Do you have to obtain disclosures from faculty and planners if the topic is non-clinical and there's no possible way? It's a strong statement to say there's no possible way there could be a COI, but say you assume you're talking about something that will not conflict. Do you still need to get disclosures?
Yeah, I can take this one because we have this come up quite a bit. You know, if it is completely non-clinical in nature, so let's say it's a faculty development about how to give an effective presentation, there's not going to be any clinical recommendations. It's all about, you know, methodology of teaching and those things. ACCME has come out and said, you know, you still have to disclose to learners that everybody involved has no relevant financial relationship with commercial interests, but you don't have to have them physically sign a form or anything like that, just by nature of the content being developed and talked about. But you do still have to disclose to your learners that no one has, or that everyone has no financial relationship.
Excellent. Okay.
If there's any question that there could be clinical content, have them do the form.
Yeah, that's a slippery slope to me. That's a scary sort of. Well, I don't know.
Yeah.
We don't do any of that, so I
sometimes
guess
it's safer just to do have the form in hand so that you have the documentation. Sometimes that's the safer practice.
Okay, so we made it. Thank you very much, guys. Thank you, Derek, for having the session. Thank you for anybody that's still watching or is watching on the archives.
Still have a few people.
This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, thanks everyone. I really appreciate it, and thanks for sticking around for the little extra. I think people would be happy to have all their questions answered. So yeah, thanks. So we'll give this one an end.